These dinners once brought families to the table. Now they're just fading smells and empty chairs in our memory. How did the meals that defined home become recipes no one bothers to pass down? When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. John Adams faced a daunting task as the second president of the United States, keeping the fragile republic stable in a time of political division and international tension. His state dinners reflected that mission. These events were about showcasing resilience and fostering diplomacy during a contentious presidency. Think of it as Adams saying, "We may be a young country, but we can host with the best of them." The guest list featured foreign diplomats, political allies, and influential members of Congress. In short, the room was full of people Adams needed to impress, or at least keep on speaking terms. The focus was clear: maintain unity, promote diplomacy, and avoid the political gridlock that often haunted his administration. The menu leaned toward refinement with a touch of indulgence. Turtle soup, a prized delicacy of the time, opened the meal, followed by roast duck and seasonal vegetables. Dessert was an apple tart, a nod to both the simplicity and abundance of American orchards. Adams knew food was more than sustenance. It was a statement of prosperity and stability. Adams, never one to mince words, once joked that he'd rather eat alone than argue at dinner, yet he knew the power of a shared table. While his presidency had its share of turbulence, these dinners were a diplomatic success, blending civility with a touch of culinary excellence. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot, and here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. When fresh veggies were hard to come by, this simple, affordable dish made its way onto many kitchen tables. Creamed peas on toast. Yuck! Sounds terrible to me, but maybe some of you will disagree. In hard times, this was the go-to meal for families looking for something hearty without draining the pantry. Canned peas, some butter, flour, and milk, and you had yourself a creamy sauce that could turn a humble slice of toast into a meal. I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but creamed peas on toast were the purest form of comfort. You didn't need fancy ingredients or hours of prep time. Toss the peas in a quick white sauce, pour it over toast, and voila, dinner is served. It was filling and warm, with just the right amount of creamines to make you forget that it was actually a can of peas and a piece of toast. Creamed peas on toast came with a great bonus. It was quick to prepare, making it ideal for those nights when you were hungry but didn't have much to work with. It won't win you any culinary awards, but creamed peas on toast was a no-fuss comfort food that got the job done. Hold it all together. When it came to stretching a dollar, no part of the animal went to waste. Pig's feet, one of the cheapest cuts available, were a staple in rural working-class homes. Boiled until tender, then breaded and fried, they transformed from tough and bony to crispy on the outside, rich and gelatinous on the inside. For families who had to make do with what they had, breaded pig's feet was as practical as it was flavorful. Offal meats like pig's feet were widely available and far more affordable than prime cuts. The long boiling process broke down the connective tissue, turning what was once tough and chewy into something melt-in-your-mouth tender. The breading and frying added texture, making it feel less like survival food and more like a proper meal. Served with mustard or vinegar, the tang balanced out the richness, while some families paired it with a side of potatoes or greens. For many, this wasn't just a meal, it was a tradition. Whether eaten at a family table or bought from a local butcher's counter, it was a reminder of a time when food was respected, nothing was wasted, and even the humblest ingredients could be turned into something worth savoring. During the Dust Bowl, one thing that was actually more common than you may ever think was lasagna with homemade noodles. Though of course, as with everything here, there is a catch. It's not the lasagna you're thinking of or the one Garfield's famous for falling in love with. Not anywhere close, no. It was instead vegetable lasagna, and the noodles were really DIY serviceable versions that just barely met the mark. It was such a disaster in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas that people there were lucky to have anything even remotely resembling noodles still. After all, most of the stuff you'd use for homemade noodles was going through crop failure or food shortages. People really began to get into homemade noodles after they had a bit more experience growing food on their own, and when they could more reliably get potatoes out of their victory gardens. As far as the lasagna went, cabbages, spinach, carrots, kale, onions, broccoli, anything people had that was green would go in it. This was also a dish that inspired people to really take advantage of canned food too, and they definitely did by substituting a lot of root vegetables with canned goods. Don't get the wrong idea though, these were really makeshift versions of both dishes. It was nowhere near an actual vegetable lasagna either. It was more fitting to call it a lot of layered vegetables, really. Few meals capture the essence of Southern cooking, like fried chicken with cornbread and collard greens. Each component has a rich history that has shaped American culinary traditions, and together they create a trifecta of flavor, texture, and nostalgia. Fried chicken, with its golden, crispy crust and tender interior, dates back centuries. European immigrants brought the concept of frying poultry, but it was African-American cooks in the South who perfected the technique, seasoning the chicken and frying it in cast-iron skillets. By the mid-20th century, it was a Sunday staple, served to mark special occasions or simply as a reward for the week's hard work. Cornbread, meanwhile, is a true American original, rooted in Native American cooking. Made with cornmeal, it became a Southern classic for its simplicity and versatility. Whether sweetened with a touch of honey or served savory, it's the ideal partner for soaking up juices from the chicken or a splash of hot sauce. And then there are the collard greens, slow-cooked with a bit of pork or bacon fat for a smoky, hearty flavor. Rich in vitamins, they're proof that comfort food can also be nutritious. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Franklin D. Roosevelt's state dinners during World War II were far from ordinary. They were pivotal moments of wartime diplomacy. In 1943, he hosted a dinner that brought together two of the most influential leaders of the Allied forces, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. This was a strategic summit designed to solidify alliances and chart the course for victory. The menu was a comforting mix of American tradition and wartime practicality. Guests dined on roast turkey with oyster stuffing, a dish that gave a nod to American holiday feasts. Creamed onions added a rich, homey touch, while English plum pudding, a classic British dessert, bridged the gap between the Allies' different culinary traditions. And to wash it all down, Roosevelt served wine from the White House cellar. The guest list, aside from Churchill and Stalin, included other key Allied leaders, each with their own role to play in the military strategy discussions that followed the meal. The dinner was a blend of high diplomacy and camaraderie, with Roosevelt skillfully using the table as a venue for crucial talks on defeating the Axis powers. Churchill, never shy about his appetite, was said to have enjoyed the food so much he joked, "If we lose this war, at least we'll have had a good dinner." The dinner, after all, was about shaping the future of the world. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles and maple syrup. Something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired, a main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. At a time when every penny mattered, families had to get creative with what they had in the kitchen. A can of corned beef, a dollop of mayonnaise, and a spoonful of relish. These simple ingredients came together to create a spread that could stretch across an entire loaf of white bread. Monkey meat sandwiches were quick, required no cooking, and made use of pantry staples that were cheap, long-lasting, and easy to find. Corned beef was a product of necessity, not luxury. During World War II, canned meats became a lifeline due to rationing, And even after the war ended, they remained a budget-friendly option for working-class families. The addition of mayonnaise provided richness, while relish balanced it out with a tangy bite. Served between two slices of white bread, another inexpensive household staple, it was a no-fuss meal that filled stomachs without emptying wallets. For kids, it was a lunchtime classic, packed into metal lunchboxes alongside an apple and a thermos of milk. For parents, it was a way to make something out of almost nothing. Some might cringe at the thought today, but back then, this frugal creation was a reminder that resourcefulness often tasted better than it sounded. At a time when every penny mattered, families had to get creative with what they had in the kitchen. A can of corned beef, a dollop of mayonnaise, and a spoonful of relish. These simple ingredients came together to create a spread that could stretch across an entire loaf of white bread. Monkey meat sandwiches were quick, required no cooking, and made use of pantry staples that were cheap, long-lasting, and easy to find. Corned beef was a product of necessity, not luxury. During World War II, canned meats became a lifeline due to rationing, and even after the war ended, they remained a budget-friendly option for working-class families. The addition of mayonnaise provided richness, while relish balanced it out with a tangy bite. Served between two slices of white bread, another inexpensive household staple, it was a no-fuss meal that filled stomachs without emptying wallets. For kids, it was a lunchtime classic, packed into metal lunchboxes alongside an apple and a thermos of milk. For parents, it was a way to make something out of almost nothing. Some might cringe at the thought today, but back then, this frugal creation was a reminder that resourcefulness often tasted better than it sounded. So if you go on over to the African American community during this time, especially in the rural South, then you'll find that a lot of them were introducing Americans to something new. Black-eyed peas and collard greens were a traditional pairing that was passed down in their community for ages, and it really pulled its weight for everyone throughout the Depression. Before all this mess had started, people weren't really too aware about the benefits of a black-eyed pea or how easy it was to grow. In fact, beyond navy and pinto beans, the average American didn't really think about what else was out there. Maybe the occasional split pea, but that's it. Collard greens still had a lot more of a reputation for being a super healthy dish you should always be eating. But it was hard to get the kids onto that kind of food. The hunger that most people would experience would push people out of their bubbles and have them eating anything available, though. Black-eyed peas were still one of the easiest things to grow, and it was especially popular throughout African American communities, even more so than usual. They had always made a lot of these, but now they were living by it too. With roots in Southern cooking, smothered chicken with onions and gravy is the perfect blend of crispy chicken, tender onions, and rich gravy that makes you want to go back for seconds, and maybe even thirds. Smothering food, whether it's chicken, pork chops, or beef, is an iconic Southern technique. The term smothered refers to cooking the meat slowly in its own juices or a flavorful sauce, often with onions or bell peppers, until it's tender and full of flavor. For this dish, the chicken is first browned to achieve a crispy golden skin before being smothered in sautéed onions and a gravy made from pan drippings. The result is a plate of food that's pure comfort. Gravy, of course, is the magic behind smothered chicken. Made from the fond left in the pan after frying, it's rich and savory, sometimes thickened with flour or cornstarch and seasoned to perfection. And those onions caramelize beautifully, adding sweetness and depth to every bite. Smothered chicken is like a hug on a plate, if that hug could also be crispy and covered in gravy. It's a dish that brings people to the table, no matter the occasion. George H.W. Bush's state dinner in 1990 was a momentous occasion, held at the end of the Cold War, a historic turning point in U.S. history. The dinner celebrated not only the triumph of democracy, but also the U.S.'s leadership in bringing an end to the decades-long standoff with the Soviet Union. Hosted in honor of Mikhail Gorbachev, the dinner marked the beginning of a new era of U.S.-Russia relations. The menu was as lavish as the occasion, beginning with a delicate lobster tail, followed by a perfectly prepared filet mignon, both symbolizing the elegance and strength of the U.S. at the time. To cap off the evening, the guests were served baked Alaska, a decadent dessert that would have made any Cold War adversary melt. Gorbachev, along with European leaders, were invited to the dinner, where the focus was on celebrating democracy's victory and fostering an atmosphere of cooperation between the US and the former Soviet Union. The dinner was a powerful symbol of the diplomacy that led to the peaceful end of the Cold War and the beginning of a more hopeful international landscape. Bush, with his characteristic humor, quipped that baked Alaska was the perfect dessert to represent the collapse of the Soviet Union. A little fiery on the outside, but soft and warm on the inside. The dinner served as a reminder that while the world was changing, the US would remain a steadfast leader. There was a time when dinner didn't come from a drive-thru or a frozen box. It came from whatever was on hand. In kitchens where budgets were tight and grocery trips were limited, a humble combination of eggs, milk, flour, and butter could transform into something that filled bellies without emptying wallets. So how was egg sauce on saltines made? Hard-boiled eggs were mashed into a simple white sauce, thickened just enough to spoon over a stack of saltine crackers. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and cheap enough to buy by the dozen. A basic white sauce, made from milk, flour, and butter, was the foundation of countless Depression-era and post-war meals, stretching ingredients without overpowering them. Crackers, those were always in the pantry, whether for soup, snacks, or in this case, an entire meal. Families who couldn't afford fresh bread every day turned to saltines as a substitute, their crisp texture adding just enough bite to an otherwise soft dish. It may not have been the most exciting dinner, but it was warm, filling, and familiar. Kids ate it without fuss. Parents appreciated how far it stretched, and for those who grew up on it, the taste is forever linked to simpler times. Potato and chickpea curry with rice was a really good combination that was pretty much built for the environment people were finding themselves in the Dust Bowl. The recipe changed with each different area and state, but for the most part, the core mix of potatoes, dried peas, and rice was the same. People would substitute white rice with brown rice wherever they could because the latter was cheaper, and it made sense to stretch your pantries out as much as you possibly could. Potatoes, especially, were a rock-solid friend to rely on for the American people. They were one of the easiest things you could possibly grow. You could make so many things perfect for a large number of people with them, and they were full of health benefits. A side bonus was that they'd really keep you full, but all this should give you an idea. It was almost impossible to exist without having a good stock of potatoes in your root basement. Onions, garlic, a water-based broth, and just thyme and salt pepper were used for the curry. Pretty bare bones, right? Yet to them, that was still a phenomenal dish to come home to. This creamy, savory casserole, ham tetrazzini with egg noodles, showcases how a few simple ingredients can be transformed into something truly special. While turkey tetrazzini is more commonly known, ham tetrazzini became a popular variation, especially for using up leftover holiday ham in a way that felt both indulgent and comforting. Named after Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, this dish originally featured chicken or turkey, often paired with a creamy sauce, mushrooms, and a variety of seasonings. The exact origin of ham tetrazzini is unclear, but the combination of a rich, buttery sauce and tender ham makes it a favorite for families seeking a hearty, filling meal. Egg noodles, thanks to their soft texture and ability to absorb sauces, are the perfect base for this casserole. When tossed with the ham and creamy sauce, they turn into a flavorful foundation that holds everything together. A sprinkle of Parmesan cheese on top before baking creates a golden, bubbly crust that takes the dish to another level. The ground beef veggie stew is the perfect combination of simple ingredients and a big flavor. This dinner dish is a budget-friendly and nutritious dinner option made with ground beef and a variety of vegetables. Plus, it's a great way to use up any leftover vegetables you might have hanging out in your fridge. You can customize this stew to your liking. Throw in some chopped potatoes for extra starch, or add a splash of your favorite hot sauce for a kick. Ground beef. Veggie stew is a classic comfort food that's easy to make, but let's be honest, it's vanishing from our tables because it can't compete with the modern options. You know, like the Crunch Wrap Supreme from Taco Bell. I bet Taco Bell doesn't remind you of your grandma and your cousins, though. Don't you love low-effort foods where you can just throw in the ingredients and let your slow cooker do all the work? Well, you would have loved festive, slow-cooked beef tips. As the name suggests, this one was a favorite at festive dinner parties and people couldn't stop raving about it. It's very simple, too. Tender beef tips simmered low and slow in a savory sauce brimming with flavor. You can customize the sauce to your liking. Add some red wine for a touch of sophistication, or maybe ranch if you aren't feeling fancy. No judgment here. Festive, slow-cooked beef tips are perfect for a busy weeknight or a casual weekend gathering. Just pop it in the slow cooker before you head out the door and come home to a delicious meal waiting for you. Turkey and gravy, traditionally a centerpiece of Thanksgiving but often enjoyed beyond the holiday season, holds a special place in American culinary history. Its pairing with mashed turnips, though less common today, harkens back to a time when root vegetables were staples in kitchens for their affordability and long storage life. Turkey has been an American icon since colonial days. Benjamin Franklin famously praised the bird, calling it a much more respectable bird than the bald eagle. While roasting turkey might be associated with grand feasts, smaller versions, like turkey breasts, frequently appeared on mid-century dinner tables, making the meal more practical for everyday cooking. The star of the plate, next to the turkey, is the gravy. Made from the drippings left in the pan, it's rich, savory, and ties everything together. A good gravy, as some would say, can salvage even a dry turkey. Often overshadowed by mashed potatoes, turnips were a go-to side dish in earlier generations. Packed with nutrients and a slightly peppery flavor, they offered a lighter, unique alternative to spuds. Mashed with butter, cream, or even a touch of maple syrup, they brought earthy warmth to the plate. If turkey is the headliner, gravy is the conductor. And turnips? They're the backup singers you never knew you needed. A harmonious meal indeed. After the transformative events of the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency focused on healing the nation's divisions and celebrating progress, especially in the realm of civil rights. In 1965, LBJ hosted a state dinner that reflected the growing unity and the cultural changes in America, especially the strides being made in civil rights. The event was an opportunity to promote American values of equality and inclusivity, while also solidifying the country's leadership on the world stage. The menu was a celebration of Texas-style comfort food, a nod to Johnson's roots. Guests were treated to barbecued ribs, tender and flavorful, accompanied by cornbread, another Southern classic. Texas-style chili added a spicy kick, while pecan pie provided a sweet homegrown dessert to wrap up the evening. It was a dinner steeped in the traditions of the American South, designed to showcase the diversity of American culture. The guest list was diverse, with leaders from the civil rights movement and political elites in attendance. This was a deliberate move by LBJ, who was committed to building bridges within the country while navigating the challenges of a world still reeling from the tensions of the Cold War. Rabbit stew is pretty self-explanatory. It's, well, rabbit stew, you know? I'm just kidding. It was a lot different from the stews we might be used to seeing today or even 50 to 60 years ago. Hunting wild game such as rabbits was how people lived off of the land, and making these stews would ensure enough food to last the day and give everyone 2 or 3 square meals. What people would do is add as many herbs, aromatics, and vegetables as they could. They took a very different approach to cooking. Some of these spices, like cumin or black pepper powder, may not necessarily have gone the best with rabbit stew. They were still added for any perceived medicinal benefits, though, like digestion and gut health. Back then, people were so used to eating whatever was available or whatever would keep them full longer. If it would taste good, that would be even better, but something tasting good was never a priority. Hunting rabbits was something everyone, from kids to adults, would be involved in, and villages and communities would set out traps for miles to capture as much game as they could. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in. A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. At a glance, it looked like fried chicken on a stick. But take one bite and the secret was out. There wasn't a shred of chicken in sight. In the 1960s, when poultry prices soared, working-class families in industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit turned to a clever alternative: skewered, breaded, and fried pork or veal, known as city chicken. The name was a bit of a joke. Chicken was considered a luxury in certain areas, but pork and veal, those were cheap, especially in regions with a strong meatpacking industry. But appearance mattered, and with a little ingenuity, cubed cuts of meat were threaded onto wooden skewers, giving the illusion of a drumstick. Once dredged in flour, dipped in egg wash, and coated in breadcrumbs, it was pan-fried until golden brown and crispy. Some families took it a step further, baking the skewers in a bit of broth for extra tenderness. Eastern European immigrants had been making versions of it since the early 20th century, and by the 1960s it was a staple at Sunday dinners and potlucks. It might not have been real chicken, but in a time when stretching a dollar mattered more than labels, it didn't need to be. Apple and nut porridge was a delightful, nutritious dish that would be somewhere in between everyday food and a celebratory treat. Now see, porridge was something that had a lot of colorful variations in the medieval world. Typically, it would be made with oats and millet, but if that wasn't available, then people could also just use different kinds of grains like rye or barley. During harvest season is when the party would really get going, though. That's when people would have abundant access to fruits and nuts, and that's when porridge could be turned into something significantly more special than what they were used to. Wild and homegrown apples were incredibly reliable. They would thrive in pretty much most major European countries. Apple orchards were something that would be seen in most village commons and monasteries too. Apples would be chopped, sliced, and simmered until they were just a little bit sweet, and nuts would be crushed and stirred into the porridge. This was a great breakfast, but if you had honey, some warm spices, and a bit of cream, it was something fit for a feast. Chicken fried steak. This classic is long gone but never forgotten. This one's pretty easy to make too. All you need is a chicken steak dredged in a seasoned flour mixture, dipped in a wet batter, and finally coated in a crispy breading. Fry till it's golden brown for the perfect dinner that'll leave you wanting more. Chicken fried steak is typically served with a creamy gravy for dipping, along with mashed potatoes and vegetables for a complete and oh-so-satisfying meal. It is basically American, and the yassified version of the Austrian dish Wiener Schnitzel, and the Italian dish cotoletta alla Milanese. Fancy names, but the same old fried chicken steak. Now I know what you're thinking. Why did this crispy golden goodness leave us too soon? Well, you can trick yourself all you want, but it's not the healthiest dinner out there. But hey, having a fried steak once in a while can't do much harm, right? Just be prepared for some finger-licking good action. This dish is messy, but in the best way possible. We're really starting to explore the deep end of medieval countryside cuisine now, so I hope you're still tuned. Our next item happens to be turnip stew, which is a textbook example of how people got their nutrition in those times. Potatoes were not actually the most widespread ingredient like they are today. It used to be turnips. This was especially true for Europe, where potatoes arrived by the 16th century. Turnips were favored because they could be preserved very easily in root cellars for winter. They were really easy to grow in poor soils, and they were hardy. Also, this was one of the few crops where even its root was edible. It wasn't a dish that had a lot of guidelines to follow, so in that respect it was a lot similar to how pottage worked. People would throw in whatever herbs, roots, aromatics, and scraps of meat and protein they had. One of the best things that would go along with turnip stew if it was available was beetroot and eggplant, which might be a surprise combination for you to hear, but was actually fairly common back then. Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency came at a time when the Cold War was heating up, and the world was looking to the United States to lead the charge against Soviet expansion. In 1959, Eisenhower hosted a memorable state dinner designed to strengthen transatlantic ties and build stronger alliances within NATO. The guest list was a who's who of Western leadership, including French President Charles de Gaulle and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It was an evening of diplomacy and strategy, with the dinner table serving as a venue to solidify commitments to the West's unity against the growing threat of communism. The menu was a lavish affair, fitting for such an important gathering. Lobster bisque started the meal on an elegant note, followed by the classic main course of filet mignon, a symbol of American culinary excellence. Potato soufflé, light and fluffy, was served as a side, while cherry jubilee rounded out the evening, a dessert that was as showy as the political significance of the event. The dinner was about securing alliances in the face of an increasingly tense global stage. With the Soviet Union on the rise, Eisenhower knew the importance of a united front. Stuffed peppers. Forget those boring pre-made things you see at the grocery store because stuffed peppers are here to save the day. We're talking about the beautiful bell peppers Grandma made on Thanksgiving. Vibrant red, yellow, or orange peppers are hand-picked and carefully hollowed out and then stuffed with a flavorful mixture of fluffy rice, seasoned ground meat, and your choice of chopped vegetables. Once stuffed, these peppers are baked to perfection until they are tender and crisp. Now, this isn't just a casual meal. Whipping up a stuffed pepper might make you feel like a master chef in the kitchen. It's also a great way to use up leftover rice and ground meat. Bonus points. If you use their visual appeal to trick your children into getting their daily dose of veggies. Yeah, the little ones don't really go for the green peppers on the table, but they might just love these stuffed peppers. You might even add some cheese to top it off. Unfortunately, it is one of those dishes that has faded from many dinner tables. Thai. Onion tarts were naturally one of the go-to meals for people, given how important onions themselves were in times like these. But one has to ask, what really is an onion tart? A typical medieval tart would basically start with a coarse flour crust. This would be made from the typical rye, barley, and maslin mixes we've seen so far, and that's how the pastry was made. This would be a vessel for the filling, which would be made out of parboiled onions and butter. These softened onions would be mixed with herbs and then enriched more with eggs or fresh cheese, whichever was available, or both, if you were doing well. This mixture would then go into the shell of the tart, and it would then be baked until you would get a lightly brown surface. In Southern Europe and the regions that are now France and Germany, this dish was the predecessor of dishes like onion pies in modern times. This was a pretty herbal-tasting dish that carried the flavor of onions over almost perfectly, and it was something people would rely on when they wanted an open-faced, savory treat. Break time. 1 second. I forgot my favorite one, potato soup, a true staple for when you're on a budget and trying to feed the crowd. With just a few spuds, I can never say that word and not think of Ross dressed as Spudnik in that Halloween episode of Friends. Never mind, allow me to continue. As I was saying, with just a few spuds, some water or broth, and a little milk or cream, you can whip up a pot of creamy soup that will make you feel like you're eating something fancy. Potato soup is as simple as it gets, but that's why everyone loves it. Plus, if you throw in a few onions and carrots, my dears, you've got yourself a true delicacy. Ooh, and don't forget the toppings. Cheese, bacon bits, and green onions can really jazz this dish up. And as all of you probably know, potato soup tastes even better the next day, once all the ingredients get a chance to, as I like to say, get to know each other better. I don't know about you, but this soup is my favorite even today when it's not made to stretch the family's food budget, but rather to bring some nostalgic feelings around the house. Bologna wasn't just for sandwiches. When money was tight and meat had to be stretched, it found its way into all kinds of meals, including breakfast, where it was ground up, fried, and turned into a creamy, savory gravy. Poured over biscuits or a few slices of white bread, ground bologna gravy took one of the cheapest meats on the market and transformed it into something warm, filling, and satisfying. Bologna had long been a go-to protein for working-class families. Made from a mix of leftover meat trimmings, it was significantly cheaper than fresh cuts of beef or pork, but still packed enough flavor to carry a dish. Frying it first gave it a crispy, caramelized edge, while the addition of milk and flour turned it into a rich, hearty gravy. Served over whatever bread was available, it became a meal that could keep a family going through the day. For those who grew up eating it, the smell of sizzling bologna in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of weekend breakfasts and weekday suppers alike. It wasn't fancy, but that wasn't the point. It was resourcefulness at its best. A way to take something simple and turn it into comfort food with just a few basic ingredients and a little time at the stove. Hamburger hash is the unsung hero of the frugal kitchen. Born out of necessity and ingenuity, this dish has been rescuing leftovers and stretching budgets for decades. The concept is simple: ground beef, diced potatoes, and onions cooked together in a skillet. But its simplicity is exactly what makes it timeless. The origins of hash can be traced to the 17th century, when the term came from the French word hacher, meaning to chop. In America, it evolved into a practical way to repurpose leftover meats. By the 20th century, hamburger hash became a staple in many households, particularly during tough economic times, when every ingredient had to count. Potatoes were the perfect partner, cheap, filling, and versatile. Onions, meanwhile, brought a touch of sweetness to balance the savory beef. Some cooks added a sprinkle of paprika or a dash of Worcestershire sauce for an extra punch of flavor. While it may not have the glamour of a Sunday roast, hamburger hash had one major advantage. It came together fast, a blessing on busy weeknights. Hamburger hash proves that even leftovers can shine, especially if you fry them just right. It's a humble dish with a big heart, reminding us that great meals don't need complicated recipes. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. In the Appalachian Mountains, resourcefulness was a way of life. When fresh food wasn't always guaranteed, families learned how to make the most of what they had, and that's where soured corn soup came in. This dish started with dried corn that had been left to ferment slightly, giving it a tangy depth of flavor. Simmered with onions and a chunk of fatback, it transformed into a rich, hearty soup that was as practical as it was unique. Corn was the backbone of Appalachian cooking, grown in backyard gardens and stored for winter months. Allowing it to sour slightly wasn't a mistake. It was a method passed down for generations, a natural way to enhance flavor when refrigeration wasn't an option. Fatback, a common cut of cured pork, added just enough richness to make the dish feel substantial, while onions provided a little sweetness to balance out the tang. This wasn't the kind of soup you'd find in a restaurant, but for mountain families, it was a familiar and comforting meal. Some grew up eating it with cornbread on the side, others with a spoon straight from the pot. Baked bell peppers with millet filling is a pretty delicious and flavorful idea. It works well since millet is both cheap, versatile, and really good for you. Plus, it doubled as an option for people who had allergies to gluten. It's not often talked about, but living life with any kind of medical conditions becomes a real pain during times like these. Most people's response, hell, even the government's, is to make supplies and resources available for able-bodied people. On the other hand, Bell peppers were something that people were still able to grow really easily around them whenever they found the chance to between growing celery and potatoes. Some common additions were things like garlic, onions, whatever you had been stocking up on growing beforehand. The best part about this dish was how it really boosted your energy for the day, which is something typically expected of spices. Still, it goes double for anything that's a stuffed bell pepper. It's a whole new experience, which, if you've had it, then you must be very familiar with the kind of zoomies I'm talking about. What's your experience with bell peppers like? A dish that combines the simplicity of ground beef and rice with the vibrant crunch of bell peppers, stuffed bell peppers have been a staple in American kitchens for decades. This hearty meal has roots in both European and Mediterranean cuisines, where stuffed vegetables have been enjoyed for centuries. In the US, it became a popular choice for families during the 1950s, with ground beef as the primary filling. The dish is incredibly versatile. Ground beef is often seasoned with onions, garlic, and spices, then mixed with rice to create a filling that's packed into hollowed-out bell peppers. The peppers, typically red, green, or yellow, hold the filling and become tender when baked, infusing the entire dish with a sweet, smoky flavor. While some recipes call for tomato sauce or cheese to top the peppers, others leave them as is, letting the natural flavors shine through. This dish is perfect for using up leftovers or for a simple, budget-friendly dinner. Stuffed bell peppers are like a dinner with everything in one package, just like a meal wrapped up with a bow. The Dust Bowl was hardship personified. Things like lentil and kale stew were honestly very necessary for the overall survival of people. Hearty greens like that would last, could resist the extreme weather and environment, and were most of all really nutritious. This was a time where you wanted to eat just about anything that strengthened your immune system. It wasn't just the lack of good food that was making it easier for people to get sick, it was also the lack of access to health care. People couldn't afford doctors, and the worst of the Dust Bowl hit all of the slums and rural areas that occupy the outskirts of so many states. This meant that a lot of lower and working-class people regularly just ate so that the chances of getting sick were less and less, though despite their best efforts, they would eventually fall sick as well. Lentil and kale stew is as super as a food can get, and I mean that in every sense, but it's not an end-all be-all. What it is, though, is a very hearty stew that works great around the winter months for an entire family. You could spin this around a few different ways for variety, and it would still work, but the kids definitely had a tough time getting used to something like this. Can't really blame them either. I'm an adult, and I still struggle with kale. A pot of boiling milk or broth, a handful of flour, and a few pinches of salt. Sometimes that was all it took to make a meal. In Amish and working-class households, Rivel soup was a go-to dish when money was tight. Simple bits of dough, known as rivels, were dropped into simmering liquid, forming soft, dumpling-like pieces that gave the soup just enough substance to satisfy. Flour-based dishes like this were a lifeline for families who had to stretch every ingredient. Rivels required no rolling, no rising, just flour, egg, and a little patience. As the tiny dumplings cooked, they thickened the broth, turning it into something more filling than a simple soup. Some versions used milk for a rich, creamy base, while others relied on broth if meat was available. Either way, it was hearty, nourishing, and incredibly affordable. This was comfort food at its most basic, warm, easy to digest, and a staple on cold winter nights. For those who grew up eating it, the sight of rivels forming in a rolling pot of soup brings back memories of big family tables and the kind of simple, home-cooked meals that didn't rely on anything fancy, just tradition, a little flour, and a warm bowl to hold. Now I'm in a mood for something cheesy. Let's talk about mac and cheese casserole. It was one of the ultimate Depression-era comfort foods that has stuck around, and for a good reason. When boxed macaroni and cheese hit the scene, it was an instant hit. It was cheap, easy, and offered that specific taste that made everyone forget in how much trouble they were. Well, at least forget it while at a dinner table. In the Great Depression era, people tried to stretch every dollar, and mac and cheese casserole made that possible. With a little milk and some butter, if you had it, you could make a meal that would make everyone at the table smile from joy, while still remaining on the budget. But the magic started when you turned that everyday mac into a casserole. Toss it in a dish with some breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs and bake until it's golden and crispy. And the same thing goes for this casserole as it did for scalloped potatoes. Get creative with it. If you have Sam ham or bacon, don't be afraid to use it. Make the best out of those leftover peppers. Turn that basic box of pasta into something indulgent. Countless families. Cornflake tuna bake was born out of necessity, a way to stretch ingredients while still delivering something warm and filling. Tuna was one of the cheapest proteins available, packed with enough nutrition to make it a practical substitute for more expensive meats. Condensed mushroom soup, a mid-century kitchen essential, served as a creamy binder that brought everything together without the need for extra seasonings or fresh dairy. And then there were the cornflakes, a crunchy, golden topping that gave the dish just the right amount of texture, elevating it beyond just another casserole. Easy to assemble and requiring little effort beyond mixing, layering, and baking, it was the kind of meal that could be thrown together in minutes. Some families added peas or onions, while others stuck to the basics. No matter the variation, it was a staple on dinner tables across America, feeding hungry families without stretching the grocery budget too far. For those who grew up on it, the sight of that bubbly golden crust coming out of the oven is a memory tied to simpler times. William Howard Taft's presidency was a time when the U.S. was flexing its muscle in the Pacific, and his state dinners played a key role in reinforcing America's growing influence. One notable event in 1911 aimed to strengthen ties with Asian nations, particularly Japan and China, while also promoting trade. As the U.S. emerged as a global power, Taft saw these gatherings as opportunities to forge economic partnerships, and he wasn't about to let a dinner go by without putting America's best foot forward. The guest list was packed with Japanese and Chinese diplomats, along with business leaders who could help cement the U.S.'s economic dominance in the region. The dinner was a diplomatic maneuver designed to promote cooperation and open markets. The menu, an elegant blend of Asian and Western flavors, was carefully selected to impress. It started with consommé with dumplings, followed by roast pheasant, a dish of both sophistication and American tradition. Pineapple fritters brought a tropical flair to the table, while chocolate eclairs added a sweet French touch. These dishes represented the bridging of cultures. Taft, known for his size, was not one to skimp on dinner. At one dinner, he famously remarked, "A president's work is never done, especially when the food is this good." But more than satisfying appetites, these dinners were about strengthening ties that would help shape the Pacific's future. Thomas Jefferson's state dinners were where politics met fine dining. Known for his love of French culture and cuisine, Jefferson used these events to foster diplomacy and cultural exchange, especially with his favorite ally, France. He believed a good meal could accomplish what hours of debate often could not, fostering goodwill. The guest list included French diplomats, influential political figures, and intellectuals. Jefferson, ever the Francophile, ensured the evening reflected his appreciation for French sophistication. The purpose of this clever move was to strengthen ties with France and subtly communicate that America, though young, had a refined cultural identity. The menu was quintessential Jefferson: bouilli, a French-style boiled beef with vegetables, paired with macaroni pie, a precursor to today's mac and cheese. Jefferson himself had brought a pasta machine back from France, so he didn't just serve mac and cheese, he introduced it to America. Dessert featured his personal favorite, ice cream, a rare and luxurious treat at the time, and of course fine French vines to wash it all down. Jefferson is credited with popularizing macaroni, wine, and even ice cream in the United States. Such a culinary trendsetter. For Jefferson, a state dinner was a declaration of taste, diplomacy, and, yes, a bit of indulgence. So, the cabbage was really similar. Basically, during the Dust Bowl, it was mostly a competition of how fast you could grow something and how conveniently you could do it. People weren't bothering with anything that took more effort than it was worth or didn't give immediate results. And honestly, I completely get them. Why would you waste your time on crops that are inherently difficult to grow when even the easy ones are going through so much crop failure? Cabbage was one of those easy-to-grow plants, and it became a national savior for lots of people. Cabbage stir-fry with onions and garlic was something people could enjoy every other day, as most of the core ingredients were things they had already been growing in their backyard gardens or preserving for a long while. At this point, the average American person was still used to keeping their experience with cabbage to just burgers, but the Dust Bowl pushed everyone out of their comfort zone just for the sake of survival. Scalloped ham and potatoes, a classic dish that brings together two of the most beloved comfort foods, tender ham and creamy, cheesy potatoes. This casserole has been a staple at family gatherings and Sunday dinners for generations, proving that simple ingredients can create something extraordinary. The dish's origins can be traced back to the mid-19th century, where scalloped potatoes, sliced potatoes baked in a rich, creamy sauce, became a popular side. The addition of ham likely came later, as cooks sought to stretch their budget by incorporating leftover meats. The result was a filling, satisfying dish that combined the savory goodness of ham with the comforting texture of potatoes. Scalloped ham and potatoes became even more popular in the 20th century when convenience foods like canned soups and processed cheese made their way into American kitchens. The creamy sauce, often made from a blend of milk, butter, and cheese, is what binds the layers of ham and potatoes, creating a hearty casserole that's easy to make but feels like a special meal. Scalloped ham and potatoes is the ultimate use-it-all dish, because who doesn't love a meal where everything gets smothered in cheese? It's a dish that's perfect for feeding a crowd and always leaves everyone asking for seconds. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt-in-your-mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinnertime classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? Steamed clams, a beloved dish especially along the coasts of New England, have been enjoyed for generations. This dish is a true celebration of seafood, as fresh clams are steamed until tender, absorbing all the flavors of the broth, often seasoned with garlic, herbs, and a splash of white wine or broth. Clams, which are bivalve mollusks, have been a staple in coastal cuisine for centuries, with Native Americans harvesting them long before European settlers arrived. The joy of eating steamed clams comes from their delicate texture and briny sweetness. The perfect clam should pop open easily when steamed, a sign that it's cooked just right. Paired with a slice of hearty brown bread and a dollop of butter, this dish becomes a complete, satisfying meal. The richness of the butter and the rustic flavor of the brown bread perfectly complement the clam's natural saltiness, creating a balanced, indulgent experience. Steamed clams with brown bread, because sometimes the best meals are the ones that come with their own dipping sauce. The dish reflects the simplicity of coastal living, proving that the freshest ingredients often make the most memorable meals. Whether served as an appetizer or a main course, steamed clams with brown bread and butter remain a timeless favorite, offering a taste of the sea with every bite. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. If one of these dinners reminded you of home, tell us which one in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe so we can keep cooking up memories worth remembering.